We are live.
It's working, Eduardo.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to follow on my German colleague punctuality standards, and let's get started at 11, like actually we always do. I think the two Latin Americans in the team have done well as well. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, to another wonderful meeting of the FINE seminar series. It's quite remarkable. I still marvel at the fact that we have kept going on this now for 2.5 years. We're getting close to 80 presentations on a weekly basis. And if we're here, thanks to you. You keep us moving and going. So before I go to give some people who may be joining us in a couple minutes to buy those couple minutes, let me get started by mentioning our talk next week. So next week, you can join us and listen to Hanga Brand. Do you see my share? Did I share the screen? It's working.
It's working.
Okay. So Hanga Brandl from the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior in Germany will be presenting her talk titled Stress and Stress Transmission in Social Groups. For those who are new, and we keep getting some new participants, let me just remind you that you can go to the website, and here you can have a quick look at all the talks we've had in the past, but you can also scroll here and learn. I'll just do it slowly to tempt you with what's coming up after Dan today and Hanga, and then we'll have Lucy Aplin, Martin Surbeck, Philippe Aureli, Michael Ryan, Valentin Andrain, Viviana Rojas, Abel Bernardou, Mauricio Cantor, Jane Waterman, and Maria Osthuizen. I apologize if I did not pronounce your last name well. So a very, very exciting fall series that we have developed. As it goes for today we have the honor, it's really very, very exciting that we're going to be listening from Dan Rubenstein. And his talk is titled Horses, Zebras, and Wild Asses, What One Taxon Can Reveal About the Causes and Consequences of Behavior Variation and Flexibility. We don't need that anymore. Let me tell you a little bit. To the young in the audience, let me tell you that, yes, it still feels somewhat intimidating. I'm trying to go through all of his CV and trying to, how on earth do I summarize what he's done? Dan completed his undergraduate studies in University of Michigan, then went on to do his PhD at Duke, and then he spent a number of years in University of Cambridge and King's College with very interesting, I noticed his first of 15 or 16 or 17 National Science Foundation grants. That one was from NSF NATO and King's College for doing a postdoc. And after that, he studied as an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University, where he's been since then. He thinks of himself as a behavioral ecologist, and for all these years, he's really tried to contribute to understanding how individual behavior and environmental conditions influence population dynamics, social structure, sex roles, etc. He's done that working with, like the title says, zebras, wild asses, horses, all kinds of equids across the world. That probably, we didn't get to talk about this, but I would speculate that just working with asses and horses probably was more likely to get him in close touch with very applied needs of the local human population that he was working with. And for a long time, he's done a lot of applied work relating behavioral ecology of wild animals to the local populations. He's been very, very active work. He was telling me he's developed some scout groups, and let me make sure that I don't miss on some of the exciting things that he's done. He engages in citizen scientist approaches. All this, and this we were talking about, is because Mampala Field Station in Kenya, it is not in a protected area. So his work all these decades has really happened in a context where humans and wildlife interact. And so over the years, He's developed this field station that he's very much encouraging you to contact him if you want to find out what are the opportunities. It's quite remarkable. Many of those NSF grants have gone to developing the infrastructure of that field station in collaboration with many governments, Kenya, of course, but not just the US and Kenya. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's a fellow of the Animal Behavior Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I could go on, as you can imagine, going over the numerous publications. I've already mentioned the grants. But I think our time is better used if you listen to him longer than keep listening to me. So with that, unless my colleagues tell me that I forgot something in the protocol of what I need to do, this is my first hosting of the fall semester. If there's nothing else, I think that I'll just pass it on to you, Dan. Thanks for joining us, and take it from here.
Well, thank you, Eduardo, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome everybody. It's good to see a lot of old friends and colleagues and a lot of new people as well. I see some of my students from my Duper online too, which is really terrific. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going. So today I'd like to talk about what one taxon, the Equids, all members of one genus, can tell us about the causes and consequences of behavioral variation and flexibility. And these are the species that I work with. On the left panel are the thin-striped Grevy zebra, the broad-striped plain zebra, the wild asses that I study in Israel and to some extent in India, and the horses, that the feral ones I study in North Carolina and the wild ones that I study in China. They're all very closely related. They're all in the same genus, and that allows us to control for phylogeny to some extent to look at how they respond to the landscape. And so what I'd like to do today is divide my talk into 4 parts. First, illustrate the diversity of social and mating systems in the Equids, examine what makes the Equids different from most other grazing species, and what makes the Equid species different from each other. And with that background, then we'll start connecting the dots, explore how ecology and social forces account for the behavioral variation and flexibility among the Equids, and then use that knowledge to understand the consequences for evolutionary and ecological success, because one of the species, the Grevy zebra, the thin-striped one, is endangered, and they all face living on a landscape with people that are transforming that landscape through their livestock in particular to improve their livelihoods. So we'll start with the diversity of mating systems and social systems. And it was Hans Klingel who was the first to note that they're divided into 2 major types. One social system is closed. The horses and the plain zebras and the mountain zebras tend to live in groups that are unimale, multi-female, and females stay for long periods of time. Our data on zebras show that groups can last on average about 3.5 years before there's an immigrant or an emigration of an adult female. So they are loyal, long-term relationships. And this contrasts with the open membership groups of the Grevy zebra and the Asiatic and African wild asses, where female associations are very weak. They change daily, and males defend territory. So they're resource defense polygynous mating systems. What's also interesting is that these are the core social relationships, and the plain zebras show a second tier of relationships that lead to the fissioning and fusing of herds, which consist of the movements of the harem groups in and out of the herds over time. And what I'm interested in is why so much variation? And the answer ultimately is that ecology matters, but how so? Well, we'll start with understanding what makes Equids special, because part of the reason they show the variation they do is based on 2 important features that separate them from most of the other grazing ungulates on the landscape. One is the fermentation system, that most of the ruminants have a foregut fermentation system, which means before the food can get to the stomach to be digested, it has to be fermented and broken up into small enough particles to move into the stomach. And that makes it a rate limiting step, so that the animals need to eat high quality food so they can move it through the system as quickly as possible. The non-ruminants, however, do their fermentation after digestion in the stomach in the cecum. We have a vestigial cecum with our appendix, but there's no rate limiting step. They can keep pushing food through the gut as quickly or slowly as they want. And the difference then means that they can subsist if they have to on low quality food, but they need to eat lots of it. So that's the first feature that makes the equids different from the species that they share the landscape with. And when you start to look at horses and zebras in terms of time spent foraging, Patrick Duncan's work shows that in horses, mares spend much more time grazing than do cows on temperate landscapes in Europe, and zebras spend almost twice as long grazing compared to the cattle and sheep on the African landscapes. So they can get as much food, but they have to invest very heavily in acquiring that food. So when you put it all together, equids can eat relatively low quality food, but they have to spend a lot of time eating lots of it. And what foraging competition might occur will be a scramble competition, not a contest competition. A grass blade is a grass blade, it's a permissive resource. And if there's limited number of them, they spread out to eat them, but they don't interfere with each other in terms of fighting over patches of food. So these are the consequences of the rumination system differences. And the diets, as you can see here, when we use non-dimensional scaling using metabarcoding from the DNA of the plant particles and their DNA in the poop, is you can see that the plains and Grevy's zebra diets are different from those of the buffalo and the cattle. And in fact, the Grevy's and plains zebra differ by about 17, they have about 17% overlap, but their diets then tend to differ as well. And part of the reason is that they eat the low quality food, and the zebra diets, the Grevy's, tend to have more digestible organic matter in their food than the plain zebras, and the food they eat tends to have more water. And so the Grevy zebras are utilizing higher quality food, and the plain zebras are utilizing more bulk. And so there's a dietary difference that we see in the DNA, but we also see where they're feeding and on what they're feeding, and the foods they eat are slightly different in terms of digestibility and water content. The second feature that makes equids special is they're neolocal like humans. Both males and females emigrate from their natal groups. Many mammals, one sex stays at home and the other leaves to avoid inbreeding, but in the equids, both sons and daughters leave. Sons go join bachelor groups, and then they have a variety of options as they develop. Some leave as single males, some leave as tandem males, and that changes the rate at which they acquire mates. The females, as they leave as individuals, sometimes are taken up by a bachelor male, but usually 70% of the time they join an existing harem. But what this means then is that the animals, as they move around on the landscape, are not likely to be kin. And in fact, this is what drew me to horses in the first place, to try to, when I was a graduate student, understand why they lived in groups. It was because if I could explain why they live in groups where there's no kinship, then I really could understand the forces that shape group living. Only if they reassociate later in life with a half-sibling would there be any genetics involved in their relationships. So armed with those two key features, let's start connecting the dots and ask the first question. Why the differences in sociality between the plains and the Grevy zebras, the horses and the wild asses? So we'll start with why plain zebras live in harems. And the answer is that females are choosy because males provide material rewards. Again, grass is a permissive resource. As group size goes up, there's no diminution of time spent on grazing. Females can spread out, they can spend a lot of time grazing. But what limits their grazing is harassment, both from their own male and from bachelor males and other males who try to sneak in and steal copulations. So if we look at the herding rate per hour inflicted on a female, males of high rank keep their females from being harassed much more so than females of low rank. This changes their time spent feeding. It changes the amount of food they can consume. And in the long run, if we look at the number of surviving foals per female to the age of independence, which is 1 year of age, females that associate with these high quality males tend to graze significantly more, about 6% per hour, and they graze about 20 hours per day. So that's about 2 hours more feeding time. And as a consequence, they have more offspring surviving to the age of independence than females that associate with low ranking males. So the males provide material rewards and females are very choosy and they vote with their feet. If a male harasses them or can't keep other males away, they leave and the male's group size shrinks, which makes it easier to defend those he has and eventually, if he's really incompetent, he'll lose all the females in his group. Okay, and these tight associations apply to horses and mountain zebras as well. And so the cartoon, the diagram below shows the male as the center, as a hub of a wheel, and the females are bonded to each other, but they're strongly bonded to him. And based on his quality, then he has more hubs, more spokes, more females in his group. But why don't Grevy zebras also show this behavior? And the reason is that Grevy zebras, like the wild asses, tend to be arid adapted in the sense that they're water independent. They don't need to drink every day unless they have very young foals, which means they can stay out searching for food and not have to stay near water. And this has a huge consequence in tearing the social fabric among females. In the diagram on the right, you can see distance to water by season, and you can look at random points on a landscape. They get more distant as the dry season occurs. If you just drop points on a map and measure the distance to a fixed watering point, and the non-reproductive females distribution more or less matches that random distribution. But those females with young foals, less than 3 months of age, are much closer to water. And as a consequence, the social fabric among females is torn because their needs for watering are very different. Females that don't have young can wander widely in search of food and drink at sporadic intervals, whereas those with young foals, like plain zebras, have to drink every day, so they have to stay near water. And that tears the social fabric and creates a conundrum for the males. Males face a dilemma. Both sets of females are equally valuable in terms of reproduction. So instead of having to choose which groups to associate with, males establish territories, with the dominant ones establishing territories near water so they can associate with females that are coming and going and drinking every few days, and mate with those females that stay near the water for 3 months because they have a postpartum estrus starting at 3 weeks after giving birth. And so the Grevy zebra, like the wild asses, have a fission-fusion society because of their water independence, which tears the social fabric among females because females have different watering needs depending on their reproductive state. So the same pattern we see in Grevies applies to wild asses. But there is a commonality, and that is that social stability matters because it reduces male harassment. And we've seen in the uni-male multi-female groups, increased female reproductive success occurs in closed membership groups based on how much the males give females time, uninterrupted time to forage. But ironically, it also occurs to some members in the open membership society as well. You can see on the panel on the left that the females that are non-lactating, that are wandering distantly from water amongst male territories, harassment rates are low because females are spread out on a landscape. The inverse square law from water, there's more space for them to wander in, and they don't harass each other, and the males are staking out territories so they can move from one male to the other. And the bachelor males stay near water. They don't wander as much out in the outback where the females are foraging. But females that are near water, unless they stay with one male, if they move across male territories, they get harassed a lot. So male harassment of females is highest to lactating Grevy's females unless they stay with one territorial male, which means that, in fact, those females are forming short-term harem relationships with one male if they stay with one male, much like the plain zebras do. But that's a very temporary bond because we've seen when a predator kills their young, the females immediately abandon the territorial male near water and move out into the hinterlands where the resources are less overgrazed around the watering point. And so there is a commonality that the male's material rewards play important roles in both species, permanently in the plain zebras and ephemerally for short periods with the Grevy zebras. The second question then becomes, why is it that plain zebras, unlike horses, form herds? And this goes back to some of my early research where I worked on a variety of ranches where the ranch managers had very different strategies of how they related to zebras. In those days, hunting was allowed. So on some ranches, they allowed hunting where the hunters took out bachelor males, because the skins were more valuable. Males are black and white skins, females are browner and white skins, and bachelor males had fewer scars on their skins. So they would take those males out and change the bachelor stallion ratio, change that cuckolding pressure, which we see is so important to reduce for females to forage well. So I had some ranches that killed bachelor males, some that didn't kill any males, and some that took out entire harem groups because they were providing food for other ranches who had tigers and other lions as pets that they needed large quantities of food for. So I had a range of pressure, cuckolding pressure. We also had ranches that excluded lions by fencing. Others didn't, so we had different predator pressure. And of course, the landscape is variable, some richer and some poorer, some bushier, some more open than others. So we could then look at what the role of predation was, what the role of food was, and what the role of sexual selection, the pressure by bachelor males were on why zebras, plain zebras, formed herds. The first thing we found out is that predation doesn't have a direct effect on group size. It's important. Our predator index is a weighting of the different impact that lions, hyenas, and leopards have based on their abundance. And as the predator index goes up, zebra density goes down. Zebras avoid areas where there are active predators. And so that will change a lot of the social relationships among males and among females. So it affects density, but not directly affecting a herd size. Food did matter, that the quantity of food tended to be a magnet and brought zebras together, and herds started to get larger. But the dominant effect, just like we saw with the core groups, was intruder pressure. That is, the number of bachelor males went up, the number of herds coalescing, the number of harems coalescing to form herds increased. And this was the dominant force. Now, the question is, why did this occur? And this occurred because of predation indirectly. Predators likely matter because in most groups, the core group is already about 10 individuals. And as I will show you shortly, by the time you're in a group of 10, the risk of being eaten goes down. In most horses that I study, most of the populations, the bachelor groups are 2 or 3 individuals. But as soon as you get predators on a landscape, they form groups to make bachelor male groups of 9 or 10. And it's that pressure that becomes a burden on a single male. And so this is a summary of some data that we have, that if you look at grazing intake rate, a solitary harem on the landscape, the females do best. They eat the most food at the highest rate. And if multiple harems form with or without bachelors, the intake rate goes down, but not statistically significantly so, because as we've noted, grass is a permissive resource. This blade is not that different from that blade, is not that different from that blade. You can spread out and your foraging time is not diminished. What's competition there is a scramble where time matters. But if a bachelor group finds a solitary harem, the chaos that occurs to the group because the male tries to go out and push one male away and other males then circle around and disturb the females, the foraging rate drops precipitously. And we note that what seems to be happening is that harem groups form herds as an insurance policy to allow coalitions among males to occur where they can jointly keep these larger groups of bachelor males away from their females. And they often form a wall and a crescent around their collection of females and push the bachelor males off to the side so that they can keep them away from the females, and the females then get the benefit of high feeding rate. And that seems to be the reason that happens. What's interesting is it's the females that bring those groups together. Now, the social consequences of this tier is that it leads to herd size differences. So Segura Ranch is where they hunt stallions. And so the bachelor pressure to stallion ratio goes up, cuckolding pressure is up, and the herd size is really big. When you go to El Carama Ranch, where he shot only bachelor males, the bachelor stallion ratio goes down and herd size shrinks on average by 1 harem group. And this is statistically significant. And so this type of comparative manipulative experiment by the ranch managers themselves allowed us to test the notion that bachelor stallion ratio or cuckolding pressure is the major driver affecting herd size. But what about females? Well, on the one hand, females are indifferent in the sense that as long as their grazing time is high, whatever the males want to do to benefit them is fine. But females are active agents as well. Predation risk, which is very real, does affect the composition of the groups, because remember, these harem groups are coming together by female movements, bringing the males together to form this phalanx to keep the bachelors away. But it turns out that there's females with young foals are the ones that often form the biggest groups. So if we look at from a female perspective, does the number of stallions affect predation risk? No, it doesn't. But habitat does, visibility, and the number of lions present on a landscape does. And this affects the fraction of young foals in the herd, so that as the visibility goes down and the number of lions goes up, herds tend to form of harems with lots of young foals, where the risk of them being killed by the lions is great. So females are active agents in choosing which groups to align with to form the aggregations to allow males to form these coalitions. This is homophily, and it's one of the dynamic ways in which both plain zebras, as indicated here, and Grevy zebras deal with minimizing conflict of interest. Because in the Grevy zebras, the males are on walkabout most of the time searching for females. And again, how do females amortize their head up and head down and time on vigilance? If they have a common interest and not a conflict of interest, in other words, females in the same reproductive state having the same interest, then they were more likely to cooperate and work together. And again, in Grevy zebras, we see that females with young foals form herds that are dominated by those young foals. So homophily becomes an important dynamic that females use to minimize conflict of interest and increase cooperation. But there's some interesting genetic consequences of this second tier, which makes us go back to that issue of neolocality. When females leave their group, they tend to only move one home range, whereas males, when they leave their natal group, join a bachelor group, which often takes them 3 to 5 home ranges away. Now, there's only so many different groups within one home range of your natal group. And what you see is that the relatedness score of females within herds starts to go up and be significantly different from 0. Because if you're joining another group, you may have a half sibling there already. And similarly, the group you join, that harem, may also have your half sibling in that group. And again, you can see over here that the degree of relatedness is actually going up. And so whereas the neolocality seemed to indicate initially that there'd be very little consanguinity, very little genetic relatedness in groups, by the time you get to herd dynamics, because the females don't move very far, they're likely to later in life reacquaint themselves with their kin. So there is some genetic consequences of having the second tier of herd dynamics. So that sort of summarizes how the ecology shapes this major social organization and mating systems of the different species. And it's really a phenotype ecology interaction that gives us the diversity. But what about behavioral flexibility? The alternatives that individuals have within populations. So let's turn to that. And the easiest way to look at flexibility is to focus on animal movement. So we'll ask the question, why do animals move the way that they do? Well, movement can be affected by bottom-up factors, such as food and water, the distribution thereof, top-down factors, predators and parasites, sociosexual factors, both through inter and intra-specific relationships, in particular competition and mutualisms, and then what impacts those have on the health, well-being, genetics, the evolutionary success, and their ecological significance in communities. And it's that impact that I'll look at as I finish my talk today. The problem of all of this is it's an issue of space, scale in space and time, that the response to predators differs depending on the space over which we're looking and the time period over which we're looking. And so the easiest way to see this is with anti-predator behavior. So let's start with the top-down forces. Now, the top-down factors allow zebras to manage predation risk in a variety of ways. We can start with the local and the current, the very immediate response in terms of how their vigilance changes and how fright and flight through experiments can operate. And our experiments uses our robo-lion. We use these rope-controlled cars. We put little puppets of lions on them. We put up these large trout fishing poles with a GoPro camera at the top. And we put the robo-lion to attack the herd. And then we filmed everything and did analysis of the movement patterns, which I'll show you shortly. As you spread out the scale from daily rhythms, you start to see that zebras, we've already seen, avoid areas where there's lions. But if you're always on the run, you're going to lose the trade-off in terms of trying to increase your foraging success. So if animals can tune their daily movements to reduce the risk of encountering zebras and being attacked by lions and being attacked by them, then that represents a different sort of response at a slightly larger scale in space and time. And lastly, the deep structure of the society, the network of how information flows, will allow them to deal with seasonal movements as well. So we'll look at the response to predation across these three different scales. If we start with vigilance, we get what most people get is as group size goes up, the proportion of time that an individual has his head up or her head up goes down very, very quickly. So by the time you've got groups of 4 to 5 to 6 individuals, you really are showing animals having lots of time to forage, not having to spend time with their head up. They amortizing the cost by sharing out the vigilance with others. And so this is the pattern we see with zebras. And if we make the assumption that if at least one head up is up all the time, then that will protect the group by an early warning system. You can see even though it drops off very quickly on a per capita basis, by adding members to the group, the overall protection, the chance that at least one head is up, goes up as group size goes up. And so they're very risk averse. They form moderately large harem groups of 8 to 10, and that gives them the protection that they need. This protection, however, is a function of the habitat. So this is where flexibility comes in. First of all, as bush density goes up, group size goes up. In denser bush, animals tend to form larger groups, presumably to have many more eyes for vigilance or simply for dilution. And we can see as group size goes up, as we've seen before, vigilance goes down. But the detection distance also goes down with bush density, that the animals can be surprised by predators as bushiness goes up. And this is going to be a particular problem going forward with climate change, because as drought occurs, open woodlands and open grasslands tend to become bushy in their features, which reduces the visibility of predators and also reduces the ability for individuals and groups to share information. So what we wanted to do is to take out the effect of group size. And we did that by looking at residuals in terms of bush density with respect to group size, where the groups were, and vigilance with respect to group size. And then you see that when you're looking at habitats that tend to be relatively bushy, irrespective of how many animals are there, and the vigilance, irrespective of how many in the group, you can see that vigilance goes up as bush density goes up. So in the future, if bush encroachment is a real phenomena, then the zebras, the plain zebras, are going to have to spend more time vigilant to protect themselves. And the consequence for that on bite rate is that it diminishes feeding efficiency. And so as climate change occurs, we expect that safety is going to trump nutrition, and that could mean that the reproductive state of females, the ability to make young and to provide recruits, is going to go down. So the demography might change. And so this is an example of animals having the flexibility to tune their behavior to a standard risk, but there are consequences associated with it. The second is this fright and flight that I talked about with the robo-lion. And what we've done here, this is the view from the GoPro, and this is a herd. It turns out that it's a herd that consists of 2 harem groups, one here, a second here, and a bachelor male over here. The robo-lion is going to come in where my finger is pointing, and this is what it looks like from the GoPro. So you can see the 2 harem groups are organized to avoid the predator. And the bachelor male sort of had the reaction, well, he's not after me, I'm just going to stand my ground. And so this is what it looks like on the ground. But we can also transform this as if it's a drone shot. And so here is the robo-lion. These are the groups again, with the bachelor male over here, harem 1, harem 2. The green and blue are moms and very young foals, and the red are the stallions, and the gray are the non-lactating females. Now watch what happens. Notice who moves first, the moms and the foals. You see major alignment of the individuals in the two harems. You could see the males were lagging and then the males mix. So this is sort of the dynamic. We did 17 of these runs, and this is the results just of this particular case. Again, the green and the blue are the moms and the young, and the reds are the males. The one harem structure is down here. The second harem structure is over here. I marked 11 seconds for just, I'll show you in a second why, but you can start to see that the zebras let the lion, robo-lion, get close before they started accelerating away to increase their distance at about 15 seconds. Okay. So this is what it looks like in terms of speed versus time rather than distance versus time. And you can see at 11 seconds, that's when the speed starts picking up. And you can look at the slope of the line. The male slopes are steeper than the majority of the female slopes. So the males are starting to push the females behind them to move them along more quickly. When you aggregate all 17 of the treatments, and this is just a handful of some of the other robo-lions, we start to see the order parameter that we're starting to look at of the defensive behavior of the zebras. So one is herd alignment, which is irrespective of the lion, the robo-lion, just stay together and stay parallel so that you can't be picked off as an odd member away from the group. The other two, the red and yellow line, have to do with orientation to the lion. And so one is direct herd lion alignment of the centroid of the group, and the other is more complicated. It's a herd evasiveness, which is the degree to which the individuals are individually lining up with each other and being in direct opposite direction of which the lion is moving. And what you see is the dominant order parameter that matters most, especially in the early phases, at herd alignment. Cohesion matters more when there's an attacking pseudo-predator than the orientation per se to that lion. And we can see the roles are also affected. So this is the average forward position in the herd. 0 is neutral. And you can start to see that the males are tending to be in the back. The mothers and foals tend to be in the front, and the other females tend to be equally distributed in the front and the back. So that these are the ones that respond first. The male plays a role of lagging behind, as we saw, to accelerate the females moving later, and the other females just seem to be distributed. But the key is that cohesion is the dominant force in tuning your response to an attacking predator. Now let's move out to the third level, which is the regional and long-term seasonal patterns of movement. So over a period of 324 days, lions were sighted on 90 of them. And this is the Old Pejeta Conservancy. They're either sighted by us or sighted by tour groups. And the green are the plains where the zebras like to be. The other habitat tends to be bushy. And the zebra abundance was lower on the plains when the lions were sighted. So they tend to move from plane 1 to plane 2 to plane 3 to plane 4. But if they did this all the time, they would be suffering a foraging diminution. And so what we see is that zebras will respond to the predators, they will detect them, but they will tune their behavior to reduce risk and avoid these opportunity costs of lost foraging. Now, most of the predators, the lions, are seen from dusk into nighttime. And what we see is that the zebras move from the plains to the bush at night as the lions move from the bush to the plains. So the lions during the day are are in the at night they're on the plains, and the zebras tend to be on the plains during the day, and they move to some extent to the bushes at night. So some zebras stay on the plains at night as the lions come out. Others take the place of where the lions were resting and move into the bush. And what's interesting is their behavior changes. In the woods, zebras continue to move slowly and in straight lines. The turning angle here at night is that they remain very straight. This is on the plains. At night, they have very high turning angle, and during the day, they tend to have lower turning angle. And the speed also changes. Those that stay on the plains at night speed up. Those during the day walk deliberately. And what we see is that the ones that stay on the plains become more protean. They become more unpredictable in their movements. They're turning a lot more, they're moving a lot more quickly, whereas those that go into the bush continue to walk in straight lines and walk slowly, just as they did during the daytime. So they tune their behavior dependent on the relative risks. Why you stay out on the plains and graze at night, why you go into the forest, might have to do with nutritional differences, but when you make that choice, your anti-predator behavior changes. If we move into the deep structure, we start to see that we can look at the networks of the Grevy zebras and the onagers, which are both fission-fusion species. But when you look at a graph like this, it's hard to see that there are many differences. The only big difference you can see in this graph is that there's three connected components here, one big group, small group, and a solitary. And in the onagers, in the little Rann of Kush in India, there's one big group and one solitary group here. And it's why we come up with network statistics to characterize the shape and the dynamics of the network. We can count the number of connected components, as I just did, which is really the number of communities in the population. We can measure vertex degree, which is the number of other nodes directly connected. We can measure centrality as PageRank or eigenvector centrality, which is who you're connected to and how well they're connected. We can measure cluster coefficient, which is cliquishness, how many neighbors are neighbors themselves. So if my fingernails and my node here are three individuals, we have no cliquishness because I'm the only link between them. But if we put a link here, then there's redundancy. They're connected to each other. So if I disappear, there's some redundancy that forms a clique. We can measure path length, the number of edges that are short and I'm connected to them, or between this, the number of shortest paths going through a particular node. This measures the role or importance that individuals play in societies. And when we look at the Grevy zebras and the onagers, both fission-fusion, their networks are similar except in cluster coefficient, that the Grevy zebras tend to have more cliques, more modularity, if you will, than do the onagers, which tend to be more open and fluid in their movements. When you do a static network, you're pooling data over time and you lose some of the dynamics. When we actually look at the dynamic networks, which is one of the readings I gave, we can come up with some other interesting metrics. One is called community span, which is the total number of time steps a community exists, or community stay, the number of time steps an individual stays affiliated with a particular community. And you can see that the species are different. The onagers and the Grevy zebras separate out on community stay, and males and females have different community spans. And so again, when you're looking at a dynamic network, you can start to see again that animals tune the relationships depending on their sex roles and depending on their habitats. And we now conjecture that part of this difference comes from differences in key features of the environment. In India, in the Kur, the onagers that live there, the Indian government has basically removed all walls and provided many artificial water holes. So the key ecological variables that would require sort of information across generations about where to feed and where to be safe are no longer problems, whereas in Grevy zebras, we still have lions, hyenas, and leopards, and water holes are few and far between, especially in the Grevy zebra core area up in Samburu. There's very few artificial water holes. And again, cliquishness might provide some of that residual knowledge to provide individuals with how to move around on the landscape. So the unpredictable appearance of key ecological drivers are greater in Grevy zebras. The maintenance of information flow is likely essential in Grevy zebra society, and the Grevy zebra network appears more cliquish and having long-lasting bonds among social affiliates than in the onagers, reflecting how that information might be spread. So now let's turn to some of the bottom-up factors. This is the way the grasslands look in Laikipia. On Lewa, they're open, beautiful, like in the Serengeti, and the bush grasslands of Impala has had a lot of woodland encroachment. There's plenty of grass, but it's distributed in and amongst the trees. And this makes a difference. Animals move their home ranges differently on these different landscapes, and they also do it seasonally. So this is looking at data in the dry season in December, between the rainy periods in 2011, and May at the end of the rains, the long rains in the following spring. And we're using NDVI, which is the relationship between near infrared and red, and it's often used as a measure of greenness on a landscape. And so you can see in the second picture after rain, the landscape gets greener and the home ranges extend out into this green area. They don't abandon part of their home range, they just extend it. And what we see is rains increase the distance traveled per day. So if you look at May and December, they're statistically significantly different, almost 2,000 meters more travel. And they also increase permanent spread from permanent water. When it's raining, there's pools to drink from. You don't have to return to these fixed watering points that are reliable to drink from. And so the animals can use their landscape differently during the rainy period, during the not rainy period. And so water and food drive home range size distribution and movement patterns. We can also look at the socio-sexual factors, and we'll start with intraspecific interactions. Here you see the two species of grevies forming a mixed herd, a grevies and a plain zebra. And you can see that generally on the landscape, as grevy zebra density goes up, plain zebra density goes up. But such a distribution hides the fact that there's tension among the species. As the fraction of plain zebras in a mixed herd goes up, grevy zebra foraging goes down statistically significantly. But the reciprocal is not true. As the grevy zebras go up, plain zebra foraging is unaffected. And so there's a one-way impact of interspecific competition, that the plain zebras, when they become abundant, start to negatively impact the ingestion rate of the grevy zebra. And what this means is that the grevy zebra moves on, and because they're water independent, they can leave areas and go out and search for food. But what appeared before to be completely voluntary now seems to suggest that the presence of a large number of plain zebras serves as a push to push the grevies who can stay away from water to be away from water, searching for food where they're not going to be competing with the more abundant plain zebras. These same sexual social differences appear in the wild horses, the Przewalski horse in Kalamani Reserve in China. Here's the horses, here's the landscape. This is a steeper grassland there. And again, when it rains, they can drink where the water is. They don't have to drink at watering holes. And these are the groups ranked: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. Alpha and delta form a partnership. The lowest ranking group parasitizes the dominant group, but stays behind it. Beta and gamma, B and C, on the other hand, avoid the alpha group, but they all respond more or less to presence of rainfall or not. They're more independent. They can use the landscape right after the rains. But what's really interesting is the distance traveled is a function of dominance. It's not a statistically significant one with the small sample size, but it's a strong trend that the beta and gamma group, as soon as it rains, leave the area of the permanent water sources, whereas the alpha and the delta group do move out a bit, but they basically can stay in the area where there's both food and water. And so the release is mainly for the middle rankers that were being outcompeted. So there's an interaction between rank and foraging. Food and water matter, but it's mediated by social sexual factors. So now I'd like to turn to the conclusion, which is, how are these impacts of movement affecting the well-being of the zebras, especially when they have to cope with people on their landscape? So this article by Jeffrey Gittleman argues that the loss of fertile lands is fueling a looming crisis across Africa. that the presence of pastoralists in their herd are diminishing the land to such a point where the wildlife and livelihoods of people are going to be negatively impacted. The question is, can coping with people occur on this landscape? And if so, how? Well, let's look at the effect of the two zebras, how they're doing nationally in Kenya. In Laikipia, plain zebra numbers continue to increase, and Grevy zebras, by the red line in the second panel, are decreasing over time. And even on the Lewa Conservancy, which had the largest private population, the numbers since 1999, when lions appeared there, have been decreasing. And so the Grevy zebras are not faring particularly well on a landscape where lions are abundant and where livestock are abundant. And we did some experiments to look at how do cattle and zebras, in particular plain zebras, we actually used their surrogates, donkeys, tell us about the relationship between cattle and the equids. And what we did is we set up paddocks, areas on Impala, 3.5 square kilometers, and we had areas where there'd be pure herds of cattle, pure herds of donkey, or mixtures of donkey and cattle. We'd have a ruminant and a non-ruminant grazing together. And we held the density constant, but we did 2 stocking levels. Low stocking level, which is what a commercial rancher does, which is 1 TLU or 1 cow per every 6 hectares, and a high stocking level, which is what a pastoralist does, which is 1 TLU for every 2 hectares. So the density is 3 times as high in the high as it is in the low. And we're going to look at the growth rate, the daily weight gain, from the perspective of the cattle and our surrogate zebras, the donkey. And you immediately see that the gray bars, the mixed species combinations, always did better. There's a mutualism or a facilitation. And the reason is shown here, picture's worth 1,000 words, is that our hindgut fermenter can eat stems and straw that the cattle can't eat. And so the change in the structure of the landscape by the equids facilitates the growth rate of the cattle. How do the cattle benefit the donkeys? Well, they use their tongue to pull on grass. And in so doing, they take away the questing larvae, the gut parasites. And so the health and well-being, the number of eggs being produced by helminths in the dung that we collect from these animals goes down. And so the health and well-being of the donkeys improved in the presence of the cattle who were stripping away the questing larvae. So for different currencies, there was a mutualistic effect. But what we see is that the response of the zebras to the presence of the cattle is actually subtly different. And this is some work we did this summer during the drought. So the cows grazed the southern portion of Impala. Impala is about 55,000 acres, and it's really divided into 3 parts: the south, the central, and the north. And the cows were in the southern portion for all of April, May. And in June, the cattle manager moved them at my request into the central area here. So the cows had done the grazing here and then moved. And what we see from the aggregate of the first month of data is that the plain zebras in red preferred to stay in the area where the cows were. And the blue, the Grevy zebras, some of them did as well. But the green represents where the cattle are in July. And you can see the Impala herds didn't move very much. They stayed here at high density, really impacting the landscape. And then one of our pastoral herders who rents our land moves his cows, but he moves them differently. He moves them over longer distances more quickly. And so their impact on the landscape is very different. Here, the grass is kept short, and after a rain, it starts to grow. Here, the grass is mixed. It's tall and short, and it changes what the animals like. We've earlier seen that the Grevies prefer the highly digestible food, the organic matter, and that's going to be the short grass that's growing quickly, not the grass that's going to be mixed in with the tall lignified stuff and the new growing stuff. So this is the overall pattern. And if you look at it week by week, when we had a rainfall event right here that brought in about 2 inches of rain, you can see early on, everybody's in the south. The cows are then moved up to here early on, and the Grevies don't go there yet. There's some plain zebras grazing there. But as the cattle have their impact over time, you start to see that the plain zebras move into the south, and the Grevy zebras move up and coexist with the cattle, with the cattle. And so part of what's going on is that the average grass height for the Grevy zebra is shorter than for the plain zebra. The distance to get to water, again, is shorter. It's longer for the Grevy zebra than the plain zebra. But what's interesting is when we can do our transects to look at percent green quality and compare it to NDVI from the satellite, you do get a positive relationship. So we can then just look at NDVI going forward rather than measuring the vegetation day to day. We start to see that there are differences between the central Impala area and the southern Impala area. That in general, the Grevy zebra, where they're feeding in central, have very much more greenness where the plain zebras are grazing. And in the south, much less so different. They're in the same area. And in fact, if you start to look at where the Grevies are and where the plain zebras are, the plain zebras are doing as well in the south as the Grevy zebra are, but the Grevy zebra are doing much better in central where the cattle are than where the plain zebras are with their the cattle they're associating with. And so we're starting to see this change in response to green up in the relationship between the zebras and the livestock. Our bottom-up factors are being shaped by the livestock, and the different species are responding to them in different ways. Now, what this seems to imply going forward is that our notion that pastoralists are always bad may need to be modified. Because if we start to look at pastoral lands in the dry season and the wet season, where are the Grevy zebras? We see that when it's raining on the pastoral lands where they've been grazed very heavily, but the rains will rejuvenate the grass in a highly digestible fashion, the Grevies migrate there. But as soon as the rains stop, they return to the grass that's been growing back on the commercial ranches and the reserves. There are 2 national reserves in Samburu. They're moving to these protected areas and to the Laikipia ranches. So the Grevies are showing seasonal movements to the areas that are impacted heavily by the pastoralists. And we've seen on Impala that they move to those areas where cows are, and then they return to the grass banks by being underutilized by the cattle and by the wildlife, but act as a refuge once the grass stops growing on the pastoral lands. So this is really important. The Grevies are seeking out growing grass, and this can be stimulated by other grazers, in particular livestock. But when the grass stops growing, they come back to the grass bank that is now somewhat senescent as the grass is going from green to brown. Can such knowledge change human attitudes and help the Grevy zebra? Can we work with the pastoralists, demonstrate this data to them to show that they play a central role? The answer is yes, but it takes some creativity. And that's where Eduardo noted that I've created a scout program where we pay pastoralists to site Grevy zebra. We give them a GPS handheld GPS, and they give us location, they give us activity, and they get data on the characteristics of the habitat. We analyze it, and then they share the results with their communities. We don't do that. We let them do that. So they get paid and earn an income, but they earn even more. What they earn is that they own the data. They acquire the knowledge from their data, which means they understand what they're doing on the landscape, and that changes attitudes and behavior. So initially, before we started the program, you can see the herds are monopolizing the water, herds of livestock are monopolizing the water during the daytime. And this particular ranch fences with a chain link fence the water hole so that the wildlife can't even use it, the Grevies, at night. But now, after they become partners in the data gathering project, they share the landscape of the food and the water with the Grevy zebra. And the consequences of this has been dramatic. When we started the project, there was only 4% infant juveniles on the lands in our population estimates and 5% foals. 10 years later, despite 3 droughts, the number of recruits in the population was increasing 30%. Our mathematical models show that once your population gets to 30%, then it stabilizes where the recruits replace the adults that die. And what we've shown now nationally through our Great Grevies rallies, our bio blitzes, is that the population in most counties where Grevies are is now between 29 and 32%. And so the attitudes and the actions of people have changed. because they participated in our science and they own the data. So let me conclude with that our study species is special, that we understand their behavioral movements, their variation, and their social relationships and mating behavior that leads to reproductive success. But I say that my team is as special as the zebras. Here are some of my Kenyan partners and my graduate students, Kaya and Severine, and my postdoc, Andy. I know they're on the call, so they can be participating in the discussion as well. But I'd like to end with this particular take-home message. Both fundamental science and its applications requires understanding the environmental causes of both behavioral variation and flexibility. There's no substitute for knowing what your animals do and trying to unpack why they do that. And you have to understand what allows them to use all the tools in their toolkit. That's where the variation and especially the flexibility occurs. Now, behavioral ecology is basically about how an environmental change can lead to changes in behavior. And when people come onto a landscape, often this environmental change is negative, which leads to stress in the animals, so their behavior becomes unable to cope with the impact that people put on them. But imagine that we can as a conservation behaviorist, understand your behavior well enough, and by partnering with people, change their attitudes and behavior so they take the pressure off the landscape, that they know what the animals, in this case, the Grevy zebra need, which is water for the mothers with young foals and food throughout the day, not just at night when lions predictably know where they are drinking and where they can eat them. So amortizing the cost, letting the zebras, which we've seen change their behavior between day and night to cope, give them the ability to use their toolkit to change their behavior so that they can survive. The key is us, understanding what they do, understanding how people behave, bringing people into the partnerships, they take pressure off the environment, and then let the species do what they do. And so far with the Grevy zebras, they're coming back. So with that, I want to thank many members of my team and the various funders, and now we can open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Dan, for a very, very interesting talk that touches on so many different levels of analysis, of studying, going from applied to the basic. I'm sure we'll have no shortage of opportunities for having a wonderful discussion. We understand that after pandemic, some of you need to go. Please remember that we'll be here again next Tuesday. You can check the specifics of the talk on the website. Regarding how we do our question and answer, we'll go only until 12:45. Dan has been meeting with the team since 9 in the morning, and so he needs a break before he goes on to his last meeting. So let's, if you have a question for Dan, what we ask is you type simply a question mark in the chatting window, and I will be taking them in the order that they are posted, attributing myself the right to skip you. If we're getting young colleagues or students, we always give them priority, or if you have already asked 1 or 2 questions, we'll try to give everyone an opportunity to pose theirs. Since I don't see a question mark, I'm gonna start by offering Dan. I'll just pose 2 brief questions. You choose one. I don't want to take too much time. And they have to do with, actually, the questions are from the beginning of the talk, but you were alluding them indirectly at the end when you were saying that we need to understand what's happening with the animals. I thought of that as we need to understand the processes, we need to understand the mechanisms. Can you share with us a little bit what we have learned in terms of mechanisms and process, either why we were able to domesticate horses and not zebras, or the other one? Choose one. What's the difference?
Okay.
And the other one is the physiology of the 2 zebras regarding their need for water. What has changed between them?
Okay, I'll take the first one first. So Jared Diamond, in his book, in the Anna Karenina Principles, says that every single species that gets domesticated does so because of a commonality, where there's strong dominance hierarchies, and we are the most dominant. And so that leads to domestication. but he can't explain why plain zebras have never been domesticated. Now, domestication is two components. One, they have to be tamed, and two, they have to breed under our auspices. Plain zebras have been tamed. Walter Rothschild had them pulling carts in London, and the Romans had them pulling carts in Rome. So plain zebras can be domesticated, but they've tamed, but they've never been domesticated. I put forth the proposition that what separates horses and plain zebras is that second tier of sociality. The first tier is the males and the females know each other really well. They're bonded for many years together. And the number of other groups that the male has to associate with when he's an adult is very small. And that's usually as they line up for water. They avoid each other. They don't go to water simultaneously like the plain zebras do. So the knowledge base of who he has to dominate to keep the females away is very small. And the bachelor males are in very small groups. And so your knowledge about them stays fairly constant. You don't have to reinforce your role relative to them that often. But that's very different from the plain zebras that live in large herds, where 10 or 20 males can come together, whereas growing up, they're in bachelor groups of another 9 or 10, and their females mixed. So they have to be able to stay strongly bonded to their females, so the females want to come back when they leave the water hole as a group. And so my argument, and it's borne out in the level, in the intensity of conflict, is that if we rank aggression from getting your dominance at a distance, you look cross-eyed at someone and they walk away, to squealing, to sniffing, to pushing, to rearing and biting, 1 to 5. Horses rarely get to 5. Most of the time, not even get to 4. Zebras get to 4 and 5 all the time. And so they're just more aggressive. And my argument to Jared Diamond was that they're just nastier animals, and it's harder for us to dominate them. And so that's why they probably have only rarely been tamed and certainly not domesticated. Now, why the water difference? That's a good question. We have not really looked at the physiology to see if the kidneys are different. The loops of Henle are longer, so they can withstand drinking not as much. But one of the things we're doing is we're doing the genomics of the entire species. There's only about 3,000 left in Kenya. We've got poop from about 1,000 of them already. We also have their stripes. So we know who they are. We're trying to do paternity. We're trying to do a kinship network. And we're going to try to do a GWAS on that to see if there are any differences between the plains and the Grevy zebra. One of the things that's striking is that until recently, there were no Grevy zebras in Laikipia, the mesic habitat. It's only as the population size of the Samburu, someone mentioned them earlier, and their herds increased dramatically in the 70s because health improvements kept the longevity of individuals, humans, higher. That pressure led to the demise of the Grevies in Samburu, and they moved south, first to Lewa and then into central Laikipia. So now Laikipia has 1,200 and 800 only reside in Samburu. So they're not a mesic adapted species. They've come into the mesic habitat. And as I showed, they're outcompeted for food by the plain zebra. So it's a relationship that wasn't common before, and therefore they have to wander more. The water independence allows them to succeed. But again, part of it's the tolerance of the people on the rangeland who don't stress them, don't harass them. And there's been some poisoning of lions so that the lion density is only 6 per 100 in the background, which allows them and their fission fusion society with the young to be able to survive. So I think that's how the water plays out.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Karsten.
Yes, hello, I'm Carsten Schradin from the CNRS in Strasbourg, studying small mammals in Southern Africa. Thank you for a fascinating talk with so many facets and so many long-term data. I have 2 questions. I will start with my second question because it more relates to what you just talked about. It's interesting how you can relate these differences in sociality to the need to drink water or not. How is it with the Hartmann's mountain zebras? Are they not also not so water restricted like the plains zebra, but they're still much more likely in their social organization to the plains and to the gravy zebras living in permanent harem groups, even though they don't need so much water?
Well, some do and some don't, right? The ones in Namibia in the desert face the same problems that the grevies do. But then a lot of them now live on farmlands where there are artificial water points. And so they're sort of getting the water that they can get. And that's the situation with Lycipia on the commercial ranches. Ranchers build lots of dams. And they do that and they evenly distribute them because they're in the business of trying to make sure there's water for their cows who are water dependent. And that's why plain zebras thrive in Lycipia. They can graze anywhere near water. What I didn't show is that the parasite levels are higher, and so those animals are more parasitized. But I'm not exactly sure what's driving the mountain zebra, but Suzanne Schultz and her students are looking at that, and they're looking at it through the same lens that we are. But the results are that I haven't been au courant with, so I can't really say what's going on there. But I know that she's got populations on ranches where there's water points and populations that are more in the desert, like the Przewalski horses in the Jagurian desert in China.
But she's looking at the Hartmann's mountain zebra or the South African mountain zebra?
I
mean, these from the ecology, they are quite different. I don't know. The Hartmann's mountain zebra occurring a lot in farmed areas in Namibia.
Yeah, I think she's doing mostly the Hartmann's.
Okay.
And your other question, Karsten?
Yeah, the other question was, I mean, you showed a lot of data on what we call social organization, composition of groups, and then you related it to what we call social structure data, especially what you mentioned now again, the bonding between the males and the females, saying there are long-lasting bonds in the plain zebras, and in the gravy zebras, it's short-lasting bonds because the females stay with them only when they're at the water hole and later not. Was this ever really quantified, the strengths of social bonds, or is this just explorated from because they are together, they obviously are bonded? Or how do you measure bonds?
Let me share my screen. You always run out of time, so let me see if I can find. I have some data. I don't know if I put it in. Let's see. I may not have. I didn't put it in. But what I want to what happens is this: if you plot number on the x-axis and look at on the y-axis the destruction of the network where it can't transmit any information, so from 1 to high, and you start randomly removing individuals from the network. So you do this thousands of times to look at when information is going to stop, when it gets to a 1. The relationship in the onagers is like the vigilance curve I showed. It goes down for cluster coefficient steeply. Random points, it stays flat. If you look at Grevy zebra, it goes down linearly, and random points, it stays flat. So if you start removing individuals by who's bonded the most, the highest cluster coefficient, who's got the most clique, take out animal 1, animal 2, animal 3. By the time you remove the 3rd individual in the onagers, the cur in India, you're at the 1. You've destroyed the network in terms of flow of information. In the grevies, you have to take out 8 individuals before you destroy the network. So there's so much redundancy in the strengths of the association that we think that that's there because you don't want so much movement that you lose the individuals who know what happened 10 years ago during that last drought, or where the water is in that occasion, or where the lions are, how their behavior is. So you want some sort of historical knowledge is our hypothesis. And the way the networks remain connected is different between the two fission fusion species. The cur show a very rapid decline. There really are no ecological problems. There's almost no strong reason to stay bonded with anybody. They're more like free agents seeking contracts in football than are the Grevy zebra, which tend to have this sort of inertia in their social network. But we think that's why, is that having that knowledge base and not losing it is critical.
Okay, thank you.
So our next, going to someone else, I'll leave out because it's Suleima. Oh, you're back. Suleima, would you like
I'm
to
back. I'm back.
ask a question? Yes.
Yes. Suleima Pang Martinez retired from the University of Missouri, St. Louis in the United States. And I used to work primarily on social behavior and communication in small mammals, particularly rodents. And then wonderful talk, really, really interesting. The question that I have is that given that climate change is intensifying, it seems all over the world, and we're getting more and more droughts in particular that last incredibly long periods of time. I'm wondering if you foresee a situation in which either, especially the two species of zebras, would converge so that they behave socially more like one another? Or do you think that the grevies can even survive such drastic climate change?
Great question. I mean, my crystal ball is cloudy on that. My sense is the grevies are going to have an easier time surviving climate change than the plain zebra because of their water independence. The adults certainly will be able to go days without water, and they can search for that water. My worry is that the infants will perish. And, you know, I imagine people with wildlife tension will get rid of the lions and reduce their numbers, so the predation impact on the adults will also go down. So that means that it's more the bottom-up factors that are going to probably drive them. And if they can withstand the water loss, which they might be able to, then their longevity will increase and they'll have more chances to make young. But the real key, as we've shown, is you've got to let them drink in order for the young to survive. And if the water becomes a problem, the young are going to perish. That's certainly going to be true for plain zebras that have to drink every day. So they're the ones that I worry that as climate change makes this more arid area problematic, their numbers are going to go down. The grevies will drop as well, but they may be more resilient because of the interoperous nature and the slightly longer lifespan. But that also depends on predation, and I suspect people will reduce predators. One of the things we're looking at is also corridors. Urbanization is now a big deal. The pressure from two cities, Rumarudi on the west and Nanyuki on the east, the policy in 2030 for Kenya is to go from Nanyuki 300,000 people to 3 million, which means housing is going to come into central Laikipia. And that is going to reduce some of the crossings of the river. The other thing is that they're building a dam called Crocodile Dam on the Wazaniro River that's going to be 85 meters tall, like Hoover Dam. And that will make that river, which has many crossings, into a lake. Now, that will protect some of the commercial ranches from walk-ons of illegal cattle, but it means that the crossing points will be reduced. And we had a student this summer looking at that, and most of the good crossing points are going to be below the lake. But again, it relies on neighboring lands to be able to keep open these crossings so that they can move from the grass banks to the growing grass in the rainy season and back again. Again, so that those are important. When we make presentations to the government, we often have representatives at the talks. And in one of our presentations where I talked on green infrastructure, which is hidden, hard infrastructure builders see. If there's a mountain, they go around it. If there's a river, they go over it. But they don't understand how wildlife use the landscape. And I call that the invisible green infrastructure. When we talk about that and we show policymakers the many routes that zebras use, their reaction is great. Pick 10 and we'll give you those, and the other 10 we're going to develop. And so that's the reality that we're facing on a developing landscape. But again, we better know where those 20 routes are, and then we have to make decisions on how to maintain them. And that's where green infrastructure comes. Currently we use man in the biosphere approach that you say there's a core area for the species, there's a shared area for livestock in the species, and the rest is for development. What if you did the difference? Wherever you had a critical crossing, there's a core area for the people, a shared area for the species, and everything else for the species to get into that corridor. That's the sort of thinking that we have to have with the government. But again, it's only going to happen if everybody is on the same page. And it's ironic that if you're actually working with the pastoralists, they're going to be most affected by the loss of water because their herds are water dependent. So they're actually, by participating in the project, understanding the science and become advocates with you for these policy changes.
Thanks.
The next question is from Adriana Maldonado Chaparro.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for such a nice talk. I have two questions, and I'm going to start with one that it's linked to Suleyma's topic. When you're dealing with a conflict between the humans and the zebras for water, is there a direct conflict between the livestock and zebras used by the resource? Like, I'm kind of thinking capybaras have this exact problem because they use the water that it's meant to be for the livestock, with probably the difference that they basically pee and poo in the water and everything else. So when we get into the dry season, all the water is basically unusable for livestock. So I wonder, how did you manage or tackle that?
It's a great question. I'll answer it at many different levels, okay? So one is that about 10 years ago, during a drought, the northern people, not even the Samburu, so these were the Borana, the Rendili, and the Turkana, brought 10,000 camels down. And they just took over all the water points. And the pastoralists were irate. They went to the governor, to the mayor, and said, "You got to stop this. You got to stop this. We dig wells. We want this. You can't share." And what we came up with was they would dig 10 wells and save the most distant one for the Grevy zebra. Now, our scouts did that. Okay, so that provided a refuge to not deal directly with the livestock sharing. We discussed it, they argued it, they knew the data, and they won. I was totally shocked. But in general, the Grevies, because of their water independence, can let the cattle drink and then drink at the same points later on. The plain zebras, because they're water dependent, just like the cattle, don't like the cattle because the cattle use the water all day. And then they can't drink during the day. And one of the things about equids is they sweat to cool. So they want to drink at midday, which is when the cattle want to drink, when the herders want the cattle to drink. Because from the herder's point of view, that's the maximum distance, and then they bring them back to the boma. So the middle of the day is critical to get the maximum foraging route. The plain zebras and the Grevies want to drink so they have some water between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock to evaporate and cool. And so there was head-to-head competition during the drought 2 summers ago. The Grevies just moved away from the cattle, let the cattle drink, and then moved at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock to drink. The plain zebras had real trouble. They stood on the side, they let the cattle drink, they ran down. So they're directly competing head to head. I've made some models and shown that when you have World Vision, do-gooder NGOs that come in and they ask people, "What do you want?" They say, "We want a well, we want a borehole." And where do we want it? We want it where we can't graze. So they put it in the middle of the refuge where the Grevy zebra can go. And so the Grevy zebra loses their refuge if enough water points are distributed, which is what commercial ranchers do on their landscape. So it's a complicated question that the plain zebras don't like cattle in general. The grevies like the effect of the cattle and can bide their time. And as soon as the cattle move on, they move in behind them. We actually tried to test that during a drought where we asked the herders to only go, half the herders to go where the grevies and plain zebras were grazing last week. So we had very fine-grained detail on where they were grazing, but the drought meant they wouldn't do it. They wanted to just go to water and graze wherever they could. But our goal was to actually test this. And so by going to water whenever they could, we saw the plain zebras competing with them and the grevy zebras avoiding the competition. So the two species respond differently to the livestock over water and over food.
That's very interesting. Complicated issue.
It is. Yeah. And you had a second question?
Yeah, I did. The other one, it's more biological related. You were saying that the clusters for the zebras, you had to take out 8 individuals before the network fell apart. And your hypothesis is that it could be because you want to keep knowledge in it. So have you actually looked at which individuals are within the core of these clusters? And probably you have the oldest individuals, oldest females, and that means that you have like a grandmother, grandson, daughter system.
Like elephants, a hierarchical structured age-related thing. We less so because of the fission fusion, but there is an effect of the older ones, the more experienced ones, are the ones that have the higher cluster coefficient. So they'd be the ones that if you took them out, in our simulations, we would be taking them out first. But the grevies were still able to survive that, whereas the collapse in the curve was much faster. So yes, there would be a difference, and even taking out the high, because we deliberately took out those with the highest cluster coefficient first, then second, then third, then fourth, then fifth. So we were trying to destroy the network, and the grevies was more resilient to that.
Okay, thank you.
May I ask if someone has seen questions being asked through YouTube that we should take? I forgot to ask somebody to help me with that. Our colleagues watching live via YouTube, do we have any questions there?
Nothing.
There's nothing. Okay. So Eugenia, you're going. Thanks for joining us. I want to be sure I didn't miss any questions. No, I think we're doing okay. We have not heard from our younger colleagues. We have quite a few of them. So please don't be shy. And also some new members, Claudine Sierra. I'm glad that you're joining us from Costa Rica. She learned about the seminar only last week. So any of the students has a question for Dan?
I think Karsten has another question and Lauren has a question.
Lauren has a question. Lauren, please.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. And we'll have time to chat some more, but I was curious, and I apologize if I missed it. In the behavioral trials with the robo lion, that's really fascinating. I found that those kinds of experiments interesting. Do lions hunt in packs sometimes? Oh, I think they do at least, right?
They do, but they often pass the baton in the sense that one will attack, and then another one will attack, and then another one will attack. You're right, and the best we could do is one robo lion, okay? Because we were really just interested in the initial response, because each experiment lasted about 30 seconds, right? Mm-hmm. And they quickly, you can see they learn that this is a lion that's not going quite at the same speed as a lion. The speed was pretty good, but it's not lion speed. And it's very direct, right? We were aiming at the mothers and the young to see what would happen, and not too surprisingly, they were the first ones to respond. So it's a pseudo predator.
Sure, and I found it really interesting. I'm just curious, do they have like the wild? I don't know much about lion hunting, but like African wild dogs have like flankers and stuff.
Yeah.
Would that potentially disrupt that network entirely?
I think that's what drives what happens. So if you remember that what the graph showed of the average of the 17 runs is that the blue line, which was cohesion, stayed flat and high.
Yeah.
The red line caught up to it in about 25 seconds. And that's the orientation to the lion. In other words, the first thing they do is they cohere. You saw the first group cohere, the second group cohere, and then the two groups cohere. Then at about 20 seconds, they organize in relation to the lion.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the number one thing is to not merge, not like, cluster bombs where you have one launch and then you want the bombs to go out and destroy the neighborhood. They want to first cohere, then organize to the predator. And the coherence, I think, would fit your point that cohering first would prevent a flanker from coming. Don't worry so much about organizing against this lion, because that could be another lion that you're going to have to organize against. But cohere first, then organize to where the biggest problem is. Get your act together, then collectively move. I think that's the key that the results show.
And that's being driven by the male, right? The stallion.
Male, yeah, the male's the one that says, all right, let's speed up. And so, possibly what's happening is they let the predator come. Like, is this real? Is this predator really coming to us? I'm not paying the opportunity cost unless it's real. So they get to a critical distance, then they accelerate. So the speed, the slope is the acceleration. And the male's slope was steeper. And so he starts closing the gap and starting to speed up the entire group, at which point they'd already cohered. I think it's easier to cohere in slow movement. And then when the risk gets high, then you start to organize. But I haven't actually looked at when, so it was 15 seconds when the acceleration started. And the yellow, it's a good point, the yellow line merged with the blue line in about 20, 25 seconds, right? So that may be when that transformation is taking place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So this is how you can unpack things from experiments. Yeah.
Neat. Thank you. Maybe we can talk some more about that in a little while. Okay. That's really cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I want to skip myself, and we're going to go to Eleanor Crooks. Eleanor?
Hi, Eleanor Crooks. I've just graduated from University of Derby. I had a bit of a question based on Oren's question. With the cohesion, the bachelor males that stay sort of freeze and don't move, in real case,
it was one bachelor male, right? When we started, we just did it. And it's interesting that he just basically said, I'm out of harm's way. That's
what I was wondering, like, because he's not like going in with the cohesion. Would they, in a real case scenario, would that actually be a good strategy just to sort of not move? Or would they have maybe been taken out first because they just freeze?
You raise a really good question. I mean, he may, we say, oh, I'm out of harm's way, but they don't like him. I mean, he's on the edge. The two stallions, have been pushing him to the edge. So I doubt that he's going to be able to cohere. So if he tried to cohere with the group and couldn't, then he is the oddball and visible and in the direction of attack. So he may be more at risk if he tries to cohere and is not permitted to cohere than just staying and letting the action pass him by. But it's a really good point. But I think that's probably what's happening. It's the lesser of two evils, because if you can't cohere because you're an outcast and you've been pushed out, then being in the domain of attack and being separate is exactly the worst thing that can happen.
Yeah. Thank you.
I guess I'm next. Dan, the danger of showing us those wonderful animations is that we make the mistake that it's easy to get those 17 repeats of the robo lion chasing the zebras. That I don't want to even begin to imagine the logistical challenges of getting those done, but allowing ourselves to imagine that's easy. Have you tried? I mean, with the robo lion, I was thinking would allow you to actually test the model, not just use the model for describing what you've seen, but would it be possible to imagine you having one robo lion or two, and really play with the circumstances? I mean, either wait for the harems to show certain circumstances that then the model has predicted this and see if it happens, or you manipulate the circumstances to see if what you have described you can replicate under the situation that you generate.
I mean, science is iterative, and I think you hit the nail on the head. What we should now do is go back with one or more robo-lions and take groups with different spreads, different orientations, and attack one this way, one head on and one as a flanker. What happens? Okay, we could do that. I mean, that would be, it's definitely doable.
Mm.
It's hard though, because the robo-lion break, it hits a clump of grass and it flips over. We have 17 good trials. We tried a lot more. The robo-lion flips and the puppet falls off and it gets stuck in a bush. And
the fact that the females with the foals reacted first.
Yep.
Is that reflected when you collected the data on vigilance? Do you find that kind of patterning? I mean, unequivocal evidence that they reacted first, you saw them, etc. Does it also show that overall they're spending more time being vigilant as an age sex class? The
females with foals will be more vigilant. So what I didn't talk about at all was hybrids. So we have hybrid zebras. Okay, we have grevies mating with plain zebras. So what we have is one-way flow of genes from the grevies into the plains, and then we get some back crossing, hybrids to plains. We've had 2 fertile crossings, one died and one's still alive. So we have one hybrid 2 second generation. But what we show, and this gets to your point about vigilance to some extent, is that when we look at the time budgets of the hybrids versus the plain zebras, because remember, they're all raised as plain zebra individuals. They're because the genes go from the grevies into the plains females. So they're raised, so the nurture is all plain zebras. The nature is a mixture of plain zebras and grevy zebras. All the behaviors, there's no statistical difference except vigilance. The hybrids are more vigilant than the plain zebra. They just have an intrinsic head up, head down at a higher frequency.
As opposed to when you say only vigilance, and now I'm trying to think that I'm sorry?
Time spent vigilance, fraction of time with the head up, the number of head up, the rate per minute or whatever. Those 2 variables, the hybrids are prone to be they're actually halfway in between the rate at which grevies females raise their heads, because the male's not around for most of the time for grevies. So females have to take vigilance under their own wing. Males are basically vigilant in the mixed herd, in a harem, because he's looking out for cuckolding. And as an incidental effect, he also is finding the predators. So the females put their heads down, and so they graze much more. We don't see a strong signal between those with young and those without young with their heads up and heads down. In the grevies, because of the homophily, we have done some experiments with Kaya, who's on the line here, where the females, when they all have young foals, they come together as a group, and there they amortize the costs in a much more regular way with less variation than in a group that has a mixture of young foals and older foals and non-lactating females. So the zebras, part of their portfolio of response is to get rid of conflicts of interest, to have individuals of the same reproductive state, the same phenotype together, so that, answering your question, do the lactating females and non-lactating females show differences? It's as if they would like to show differences, but they can't. And what they do to avoid that tension that would occur is they are homophilous. They form like-minded associations. And in the grevies, because of the fission fusion, it's easier to do that. But what we saw with the harems that's really interesting is that if a harem had 1 or 2 young foals, it was more likely to form a herd with another harem with 1 or 2 young foals, as opposed to just any random harem. And again, homophily seems to be playing a role. So there is, I think, an inherent tension between those with young at risk and those not, and they avoid that tension by getting rid of the conflict of interest.
Thank you. Suleima?
Yeah, Dan, did you ever have the zebras attacking the robolions?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Zima. What'd you say?
Oh, whether the zebras, when the robolion approached after they all got together,
Yeah.
did they ever actually attack the lion?
No,
The robolion.
we didn't let it. At some point when they were looking at it and stopped, we brought it back because we figured maybe they would go investigate it and step on it. Because once they decided it really wasn't an attack, when the males then came back and stared at it, we figured time to bring it home.
Yeah. So do they ever attack real lions?
Yeah. Okay. So plain zebras, no.
Okay.
Grevy zebras, it's really phenomenal. If a Grevy zebra male finds a lion resting under a tree, it goes right up to it, stares it in the face, puts its tail up and goes like this. And the lion just looks at it.
Wow. But during an actual attack, they don't confront the lion and try to stomp it or anything like that.
Grevies do get killed. And males get killed a lot because they hang back. They're the ones back. So if the lion does get close or a flanker comes in and it's fresh, sort of passing the baton like Pony Express, and they've been running, the male's the first one that's going to get hit, and the female and the young are in the lead. They're least likely to get.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I just sent a message. Oh, Adriana. Okay, so we will. Are you next, Adriana? Am I right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so we will take Adriana's question and then we'll give Dan a well-earned 15-minute break before he goes on to his next individual meeting.
Yeah, I forgot to present myself. Adriana Maldonado from Universidad del Rosario in Colombia. And my question, it's related to the effects of changes in the environment and social organization. And so you mentioned that there was a change, or it was a relationship between the NDVI and group size, right? Mm-hmm. But did you somehow, or maybe were able to identify changes in social structure at the same time, or do you have a sense of?
I didn't talk about it, but we do see that there are some effects of the network characteristics with the quality of the habitat, so that we start to see that the group sizes change and the spread changes. Kaya, are you still on the line here?
Yes, well.
Kaya, you want to answer? Because I don't want to steal your thunder.
Yes. There you are.
Yeah. Hi there. Sorry, I was just moving tables, but can you?
Kaya's finishing up a postdoc and she's looking for a job. Anybody that's hiring, but Kaya looked at what we call Darwin's hostile forces, and so the environment shaping behavior. And she had a study where she looked at Grevy zebras in 3 different populations under different environmental conditions. So she's the one to answer that question.
And I would just add that Kaya has been a regular participant in the seminar series. So thanks. Go ahead. Yes, enrich the discussion.
So was the question about how the different forces would shape group size in the 2 species?
Yeah, through the networks. I know you didn't definitely do networks, but you're certainly looking at group sizes and spread. And you've looked at.
Yeah, we found something really interesting actually. So the Grevy zebras would disaggregate more in the dry season, and the plain zebras would disaggregate more in the wet season. And we think that might have to do with their biology a little bit. So the plain zebras, because they evolved in more mesic environments, they probably evolved in areas where it was just higher density. And so they might have a stronger response against the ecological force that would be a stronger disaggregator in the wet season, which is parasite and disease transmission in the system. Just in the wet season, that's when the parasites in their guts, the nematodes, send out all their eggs for transmission. And it's also when there's a higher risk of more directly contagious diseases. So that's when they're disaggregating. But for the grevy zebras that evolved more in sort of arid environments, they seem to disaggregate more in the dry season, which is when there's more food scarcity. And so they seem to be more sensitive to that selection force. And so we saw kind of these like opposite responses seasonally. But what was really interesting also was that they still kind of danced around the same median group size. There's actually 8 in the sites that we were studying them for this one. And so it was just a really interesting convergence in median group size. Even the range of group size and the standard deviation was very, very similar, but they were dancing around the sort of what seemed like an optimum group size in sort of opposite reaction to the seasons. Does that make sense?
Yeah, cool. Thank you for sharing that.
I think that with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop our live stream. Thank you to the YouTube